everybody. Welcome to another week of Eating at a Meeting Live. I am your host, Tracy Stockrath, founder of Thrive Meetings and Events right here, and this podcast, Eating at a Meeting. And I can't believe I've been doing these lives now since April of 2020. So I am blown away. I think the audio podcast just yesterday was like the 117th episode. So download the podcasts into any of your podcast platforms that you like to listen to and catch up on what we've been chatting about for almost 2 years now. I'm going to have a big party in April. But today's guest is my friend Zoe Moore. You would think it was Zoe, but it's Zoe at ZOE. She is the founder of Grow with Zomo, and she is an independent equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant who helps leaders in the hospitality, events, and tourism industries develop strategies to improve workplace culture and the hospitality ecosystem. Hello, my friend.
Hello, greetings. How are you?
I'm very good. And I do have to say that we officially met face-to-face at an MPI Carolinas meeting.
Was that the first time?
I think so. When you asked a question of the audience and I got up to the mic and I'm like, well, we have to think about food as diversity. And you're like, what's your name? And I'm like, I've been following, so back and forth following each other.
Yeah. One of those moments. It's interesting. Like you said, you started this April 2020, how much we've interacted virtually and you think, do we meet in person? But no. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The MPI Carolinas event was an opportunity to see that we're having these conversations that diversity, I always say diversity is not a monolith, right? And too often, when I was starting a committee with MPI Northern California chapter, and I was looking for, different members to volunteer for the committee, I was like, hey, do you want to be on the volunteer committee for DI? And they were like, oh, DI doesn't apply to me, and I'm thinking, why doesn't it apply to you? Right. And they would say, I'm a white presenting woman. What do I have to do with, DEI? So you realize that stigma is surrounded just around race and culture, and that those are the only people who want to be in a DEI committee, when it should be everyone challenging the status quo.
Right, exactly. And somebody just requoted you. Diversity is not a monolith. Fabulous. Yeah, it really is. And it actually took me, I've been speaking about food dietary restrictions for 12 years now, right? And it took me probably 5 years into that really to say, hey, this is a sustainability issue, but it is also a diversity and equity and inclusion issue. Because when we're at the table and I don't have anything to eat, I'm excluded.
Absolutely. I think what happens is, too often I see that diversity is treated as something that is an afterthought or ancillary. Like people say diversity issues and it makes me cringe. Like, oh, the diversity issues, or let's think about diversity, when actually diversity should be so interwoven into the way that we operate and function. Every day, people show up in spaces where they're excluded and they have to, or they're expected to fit into that dominant culture, and so you really have to think of diversity as being every aspect of how we talk, how we eat, how we, work, every aspect of our lives. We have to be considerate that there's more than one type of person. There's more than one phenotype, more than one religion, and so the diversity of us goes beyond our skin color. It's all the ways that we identify and the way that we show up in the world. So.
Right. And it's whether you have long fingernails or you don't have long fingernails, right? Or you bite your nails or you don't bite your nails, right? Things like that.
It does get into those weeds. And, sometimes when and I love having those conversations just the same as we get into the nuances of diversity. But I also don't want people to get away from what the conversation's really about. And that's typically the uncomfortable conversation that people steer away from. We are talking about racism, we're talking about sexism, we're talking about ableism, and we're talking about the history of groups that have been historically and are presently excluded. And so a lot of those conversations stem from there. So when we talk about diversity of thought, I can have that conversation as long as we're not avoiding the topic around, how diversity has evolved over time and why it was even necessary, specifically in US context, in the first place. And so we have to be able to have those conversations, especially when we're talking about food,
Right.
culture, ethnicity, religion. Food is such a deep part of those identities. And so we have to talk about why they've been suppressed or oppressed, and why it's such a surprise for people to find out that people don't eat foods in a certain way or on certain foods. Yeah.
Well, and that kind of brings up the post that I just did a few minutes ago, just before we came on air, is that my friend Joseph posted something that he was learning about for healthcare DEI, and it was talking about Buddhism and Jewish and all these others, and that these religious-based dietary needs that patients might have these. But then I went just randomly, and I'm just going to show this. I just got Bryant Terry's Black Food book, which I haven't dived into, but there's a whole section on food and faith.
Yeah.
And I just love this one thing, and you're going to correct me on how to say that, and I just went blurry again. Auto unblurry, and the clergy and practitioners of various religions use food to communicate with their gods. I'm like, from the beginning, right? And so a lot of this has been lost in that, or because we don't follow that religion, we don't necessarily understand. And so we have to have those conversations.
Yeah, there's an image that I give. I'm teaching a course right now, and the discussion forum is really engaging and hearing as people have these aha moments. But, there's one image I use. It's called the wheel of power and privilege. And in the center, it has, identities or characteristics that have been normalized. And it's white presenting, able body or non-disabled, wealthy, Christian, English speaking. And so when you look at that identity, that is how our society is built, around that identity. And as you go out to other identities or characteristics, those are individuals who are on the margins. And so when we're talking about food, if you're not a Christian, which is at the center, then you get othered, you get pushed to the margins, where people rarely know the details or the practices behind your food choices. So you mentioned, Jewish, or, with the Muslim faith, when we talk about, halal versus kosher, really when people hear those terms, like we talked about, prior to hopping on live, they get overwhelmed. And what this conversation really is about is curious research. Like if somebody tells you, oh, I can't eat at your event because it's not halal or kosher, your next question should be, can you tell me more? Or, let me go look that up. And then you learn that there is a spiritual connection to the food and the way that the food is prepared. And so it goes back into faith. It goes back into the connection to food, that it's more than just for sustenance,
Right.
And
exactly.
It's a deeper story.
Well, and I have one question for you that I want to jump to, but I also want to say, it brings into that food allergy thing, because I eat a specific way because that's going to kill me. And there's so many of my friends who are like, Celiac and the Beast is when she was a guest last year. She's like, why do you have such a conniption on the fact that if I eat this, it's going to kill me? What problem do you have with that? Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's, food is energy, right? And so whether you're associated with a known religion like Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, you just being a spiritual person, people choose to prepare and cook their foods a certain way. Yours being restrictions, and even during the MPI Carolinas we talked about, it's not just about food restrictions; it's also food preferences, because we know our bodies and how our bodies respond. And so, in order for me to enjoy this experience that you've invited me to, I don't want to be bloated. I don't want to have an allergic attack. I want to breathe. These are just some basic things that I want, so that I can hear the speaker and feel comfortable when I'm talking to people. It's nothing that somebody should go into a conniption over. Instead, that again is our ability to talk about our differences and say, okay, so I don't eat that way, or I don't know anything about the way that you eat, but I want to learn and I want to have that shared experience. So.
Okay. So one thing that I noticed I'm putting this on Do Not Disturb, so nobody calls me. When I read your bio, it said an independent, equity, diversity, and inclusion person. So I quickly noticed when you sent it to me the other day that equity is the first word that you use, because where we see it a lot is DEI, but you put equity. So can you explain that?
Yeah, definitely. So on this journey, like I said, my journey it started really back in the military. I was an equal opportunity representative, but as I got into the hospitality industry, and you hear the acronym DEI and diversity, and I was reading these articles, and it was just saying, people lean towards trying to achieve diversity, and it ends up in tokenism, where you just look at the vanity metrics. Okay, now I have an African American in my, working for me. Now I have an Asian person. Now I have a person with a disability in my images or in my workforce. And the problem with that is those individuals will be a part of the workforce, but they didn't have equity. They weren't involved. They weren't invited to the table. Their contributions weren't seen as viable. And so when we put the emphasis on equity, that's the environment we're seeking to develop, is an equitable experience. Like when we talk about food, we want everyone to have an equitable experience. We don't want just people who love meat to enjoy themselves, but those who are vegetarians want to have an experience, not just a piece of lettuce on the plate, right? So the emphasis on equity is the environment that we need to develop first. And then, as I say in my quote, when inclusion, so I focus on equity and inclusion, but that acronym doesn't work out as well. But when inclusion is the behavior, equity is a strategy, diversity will be the result. And so when you create an environment that is one of belonging and inviting people to be liberated to be their whole self, then you'll attract people from different backgrounds, people of different faiths, and people who eat differently into your space in a more organic way.
Well, and it reminds me, and I've told this story before on another show, but it reminds me of a planner who was planning a job fair kind of event over a couple of days. And she had quite a few people who had food allergies or different dietary restrictions through the week. And every day they were really good about requesting their needs or requesting their personalized plates. I don't like to say special. It's like your personalized plate.
Right.
And the last day when they were having their dinner with their most promising future employer, no requests were made. Because they were not allowed, they didn't feel comfortable bringing them their best self to the workforce, in front of that employer. And she's like, what do I do?
Right.
And my thing is like, you need to address this with the employers so that they can start describing their work environments as like, hey, when we have pizza, we make sure that we have gluten-free options and vegan options and, things like that. Yeah.
And that's the importance of someone who's in as the event planner or that's running the actual event, that's where vulnerability is really important, where you make that announcement, that it's really important that we care about your customized plate. We care about your needs because we want you to enjoy this experience. We want you to be able to show up your best self as you're doing these interviews. And so once you kind of like create that space and say that, then people are like, oh, now I can say, what my preferences and my restrictions are.
Right.
And that also talks about, the aspect of risk mitigation or risk management. We think about physical threats when we're designing an event, but we often forget about psychological and emotional safety. And so if we are in a space where that power dynamic is our future employer and we're trying to impress them and we don't want to be ostracized or othered, it's like, okay, let me fit into, if they're eating chicken, I won't take a bite, but I'll just, sit here and smile and be able to relate to them. Because if I tell them that, I have this preference or restriction, they may feel like they have to make accommodations for me and feel like I'm a hassle. It's us saying that if this employer or this environment doesn't want to abide by or adhere to my needs, then they don't value me and they don't deserve my contributions.
Well, and I bring up that, I brought it up actually yesterday, and Deanna's saying, I love that reminder to focus on the environment we're creating on our attendees first, and the diversity will be a result. That's so true. And it's, and now I just lost my train of thought, but because I put that up there, but it's about thinking about how we create that universal experience across the board. Absolutely. And, and our good friend, Joan Eisenstadt, she has she utilizes a scooter when she's at events, right? And my friend Elisa Hayes, who's been on the show too, she utilizes a wheelchair. And what's our experience in designing that environment again for them to get to the table?
Right.
And
we talked about that at the North Carolina event, where, we were saying that if you have customized plates or requests, it's not like find a table that you throw in the corner and you say, there's your food over there, while everybody has this well-designed and decorated experience. You have to incorporate it. And what you find when you're really focused on universal design, the needs of a few will benefit everyone, There's a quote that I use. It says, when we design for the most marginalized of us, it benefits all of us. And so my experience, I'm an event planner sometimes. So if you ever need event services, I like to support event planners now because I'm more in the consultant space. But I did an event with my client, Gloria and Tamo. If you don't know Glo and Tamo and you want to be motivated, definitely go follow. I'll share some more information about her, but she does events for women. And so we did an event in Puerto Rico. And so as I was talking to the chef, now I really go into the kitchen. I went to culinary school. I go into the kitchen. I want to talk to the chef. I want to get to know who is the person preparing the food so that we can actually, have an experience there so that they're really into designing that program. And so we were talking about dressings for the salads and all that kind of stuff. And I said, you know what, let's make the dressing vegan. And they were like, are you sure? But what about everyone else? And I was like, the dressing tastes good. We can have vegan dressing across the board, And the chef was excited because they could get creative around the recipes. And so later on, or after the event, an attendee goes on TikTok or Twitter, one of those great platforms, and literally eyes are all watery and saying, y'all, I have never been to an event where they had vegan dressing. I always just have to have a dry salad because nobody thinks about vegans. It got me choked up. And her response was just like really emotional because she felt seen, It was just a simple choice to say, this vegan dressing is not going to harm everyone else. But, more people who are vegans are going to be able to say, ooh, now I can, live out loud. I can say I'm a vegan without somebody having this overwhelmed response or reaction. So,
yeah, I mean, and I posted an article earlier today about how Greenbuild created an entire vegan program, for most of their meals, but it wasn't completely, but we have to, and they even said, maybe we have offered chicken and fish on, as a customized plate or personalized plate in the case that somebody does want to have that animal-based protein, so it's looking at it from designing that menu vegan and then adding everything onto it, because then you can start with the base. And granted, some vegan, you can't have nuts or you can't have soy because of food allergies, a variety of reasons, but starting to do that. Shamika just wrote in, yes, love that quote. And it's so true. When we plan and coordinate for the most marginalized, everyone truly benefits and feels included completely.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions that you posed to me beforehand that you wanted to talk about was, how can meeting and event professionals leverage food and beverage experiences to contribute to the local economy? So, yeah. So let's talk about that.
When we think about the economic significance of the meetings and events industry, we're talking about our large contribution to the gross domestic product, right? And a lot of event planners may not be familiar with how much impact that we have on, the communities that we serve or the communities where our events, have those backdrops. And so really doing business with local small businesses, restaurants, mom and pop restaurants, food trucks, really helps those businesses thrive. And so think of ways to incorporate them into our events. For example, I've went to industry events. I won't drop any names or per se, because it's like I go into these events with my camera and I'm taking notes on how we always bump into each other at events, and Tracy's out there like snipping pictures and stuff like that. But it's to give feedback. And so I went to an event, and there were food stations, and I love food stations because I get a little bit of sushi, I get some chicken, I get some salad, different food stations. And so one food station was sushi, and I love sushi. And it was terrible. And it was terrible because it was, in a sense, it was prepared from a westernized standpoint instead of it actually being, prepared by someone who knows how to make Japanese food or how to make sushi. And so my question after the event was, why didn't you, I mean, we're literally in San Francisco. Why didn't you reach out to a local restaurant and see how we could bring them into the space? Do you know that one buyout for them could mean, one
A
quarter,
year's worth. Yeah.
right? And so what would have been to walk into this food station and have this, local sushi restaurant with, the family there, they would take so much pride in that food station and that opportunity. And so although we have some existing rules and regulations that are saying, well, that's not how we do it. Well, the way that business has always been done needs to be changed. That's us challenging the status quo, where we say, okay, when we have these events, we want to make sure that we either have someone from that particular identity or culture advise us on how to make the food. And if our, culinary team is not well versed in how to prepare this food, then we're going to partner with the local restaurant. And
I
that
love that. Yep.
is, again, it helps these small businesses thrive. And if our events are really, and as event planners, we're ambassadors to cities. And so when someone comes into a city, why serve them the same things? Chicken, Caesar salad, cranberry juice,
Right.
right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So if you're in Chicago, give me some true to nature Chicago food that's based in Chicago. When I go to, wherever state I'm in, whatever country I'm in, I want that food experience. And
yeah, so for sure.
That's innovative and also investing in the local economy.
Right. But even if you're in Austin or something, I'm sure they have a Chinatown or whatever that has that flavor. So even if you're incorporating different flavors, how do you do that? I actually posted the other day an article that Thrillist just did from a woman who's vegan and traveled the country. Is like, these are the most vegan cities in town. So I posted out to destination management salespeople and CVBs. And I'm like, how many of you know who your halal caterers are, or who your kosher caterers are, or where the best gluten-free restaurants are in town? That to me is a humongous selling point for your town.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And meeting planners need to take that list and provide it to their attendees.
Yeah. I was, I went to a wedding. The family is from Bangladesh. And so, I was talking to one of the fathers, and they were saying, "Oh, you're an event planner." And I was like, "Yeah." And I said, "Who, planned this event?" He was like, "The aunties and the uncles planned the event," because when we talk to event planners, they don't understand, our food, our culture. And he said, what would be a huge thing for the event industry is for more event planners to get educated. Within, our culture, maybe there are not a lot of people wanting to be event planners, but if there's some cross-cultural education, some cross-competence or cultural competence, then we could educate ourselves. And that's a huge opportunity, is for you as an event planner to be well-versed in, someone's food experience or their practices. Yep. And so.
Well, and there's an image that I do in my slides when I present, and it's a plate, and it's dropping like audiovisual, housing, transportation, all of the things that meeting planners, meeting professionals are responsible for. I mean, there's a lot on our plate, and adding this to it, I think, but it helps embody the rest of it as well.
Right. Yeah. Again, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we think of it as this other thing that we have to do, it's that mindset shift that we need to do. We need to really, what is the purpose of us having an event? Is it just to say that we did the event, or is it to make an impact on that audience, or to have a client actually meet their objectives? Because if we go back to, I don't have my CMP, but I still call the CMP manual of the blueprint for our industry. It's the standard, right? So if we're going back to domain A and B, strategic planning and project management, those details are imperative, right? You're trying to determine what is the objective of this client. And it's not just to have people show up and have chicken Caesar salad, right? It's that part of that experience. I can't remember the quote verbatim, but that People won't remember what you tell them. They won't tell you. It's all about how to make them feel. That's the quote.
Correct.
It's there.
Yes.
They will remember how you make them feel. And if someone associates a brand with a poor food experience, that's how they're going to remember it. And people they forget that detail. And one of the examples that always makes me laugh, if you've never watched Yelp restaurant reviews where actors reenact the reviews, have you ever seen it?
No.
And so again, back to that feeling of how you make me feel. These actors would read Yelp reviews, and people would say, the food was good, but my boyfriend broke up with me. And they're thinking about a moment or something that happened in their life, but they're associated with that restaurant. So they give that restaurant 1 star, not based on the food, but the overall experience. And so
that's awesome.
It's food experiences.
Right.
I'm supposed to be here getting to know these speakers or this brand or this company, but because my food experience was poor, now I don't know if I want to work with that company. Now I don't know if I want to, if I can actually pay attention to that speaker, because no one cared about what I have to put in my body. So,
well, so you're sitting at that table hangry, or you're getting up, you're pulling something out of your bag that you lugged with you, or you're leaving. And my biggest thing is that your company has spent a bunch of money for you to come to this event, and you're having to go find food elsewhere. And if you're lucky, and especially in this day and age, that there's a restaurant on property that's open, or there's someplace walking distance to find food, and you've just lost that experience. You've just left the whole experience of the event in general.
Right.
Even the lost business opportunities.
Absolutely. When I used to plan events more heavily, I would, really get into the shoes of different stakeholders, right? Whether it be the people who are working the event, the exhibitors, the attendees. Okay, if we have to make food available, outside, like in San Francisco, there's the Moscone Center. And so there's all these restaurants, just out of the convention center. And so it's like, okay, if that's part of the food experience, what does this walk look like? What will the lines be like? What will crossing the street be like for them? Either carrying their food back. And then when they enter into the space again, where are the trash cans located? So you walk through this whole experience and making sure that you know how that stakeholder is going to feel, and that's a key part of that event, because one, the aftermath of you having to clean up behind the event, or people not returning to breakout sessions on time because they're still waiting for their food. So it's the whole food experience is very central to our events. And to think of it as something like, oh, I got to think about that too, then maybe event planning is not for you, because there's details. We are in the business of attention to detail.
Right.
And so,
well, and that reminds me of a story my friend Mark made, because an event that he attended in Toronto, they didn't provide food and beverage, but they also, so everybody had to leave campus or leave the convention center to go get the food. Well, they also didn't tell all the small restaurants around the town that this 2,000 people were about to bombard them during lunch.
Right.
And so they hurt the economy a little bit, right? But they also hurt their attendees because they didn't come back.
Yeah. There was, so I used to work with one of my clients, Black Food Collective, Rashad Armstead. He was actually one of the winners on the Chopped, the food, the Chopped. And so he has a Black Food Collective out of Oakland. And so, he runs, food trucks. And so one of our things as we were planning events, whether downtown or wherever, we would go engage with the local businesses to make sure that we weren't, blocking the food, the traffic into their restaurants. And we would have some kind of relationship where if they served, a certain cuisine, then we would have a food truck that had a different cuisine, so it was really working with the local businesses once again. And if food truck lines were too busy, right, because they're going to, be long lines, what businesses businesses are aware that this foot traffic is going to be available to them? And then how can they be incorporated into the event? You know, if they use the event code, then they get 10%. Or if they post a picture of that local restaurant on their Instagram, then, you know, they get a shout out, whatever. But to bring people into your event is also going to be important. Again, it goes back to the making the impact on the local community.
That I love that idea, because it's really adding a whole different level of experience for everybody across the board as well. So one of the things that we talked about before this, and it actually brings back to the economy, is the sustainable food and beverage.
Right.
And, you know, utilizing farmers that are local, utilizing local beverage manufacturers or whatever. But I thought it was interesting that what you said, and I'm going to read it. Vendors and suppliers, especially small, under-resourced companies that are not practicing proper environmental guidelines, need education and not exclusion from preferred vendors lists.
Absolutely.
And one of my guests a couple of years ago, Michelle, really talks about that as well. I mean, we can't exclude them from that conversation just because they don't do that.
Yeah, when you're talking about, you know, again, you have to, when having the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or EDI, I like to switch it around. You cannot skip past the conversation around history, right? And so when we look at farming, and we've looked, you know, at the history, we go all the way back to sharecropping, which is the early 1900s. And so you're thinking about that history and how farmers were, segregation was a part of farming. And so now when you're talking about the resources that farmers need in order to thrive and survive, do they have access to those resources? And are those resources affordable? So are there social economic barriers? So when you look at a list or who's doing, you know, sustainable practices, it's not, oh, well, you know, that list isn't diverse. No, now it's, again, back to curiosity. Why isn't that list diverse? What other barriers that have hindered, you know, small Black, Asian, Latinx, you know, companies from being on this list? Why are they struggling to be a part of this practice? And I know that for an event planner, that may not seem like your responsibility, but if we're an ecosystem, right? So we talk about the hospitality ecosystem, and we really want to do this intentional work of making our preferred vendor list more diverse. We can't look at a list and see, okay, it's homogenous, and think that that's normal. We can't normalize that. We have to challenge that and say, you know, what organizations are doing, you know, sustainable, you know, food practices. And there's lots. You know, I lived in Oakland, and I got so educated on food justice and, you know, sustainability programs, all the way back to the Black Panthers that people don't talk about. And there's organizations that have, you know, formed. And when you talk about the indigenous community, a lot of these sustainable practices, like, they have fancy names to them now, you know, permaculture. Those were, that's indigenous wisdom. And so because we, you know, suppress and oppress the voice of the indigenous community, First Nations, people don't realize that these practices are coming back because, you know, our earth is dying, but these are practices that were already a part of their culture. And so, yeah, I could go on about that one.
No, I mean, and you said the economics, and because there are people who it's naturally grown. They're doing every single step that they can.
Right.
They're doing all the steps that they can to be actually organic, but they don't have the funds to pay for the organic certification.
The barrier.
Right, a barrier. And one of my
social economic barrier.
Right, exactly. And one of my chef friends says he tries to do local organic, and then he does local, and then he, you know, and then regional organic, and then regional, right? So making sure that he's getting that breadth of options there in the choices of what we're doing. So one word that you brought up there, or two words, I guess you should say, is food justice. And that's a whole nother level with this. And you mentioned the Black Panther, the breakfasts that they used to serve and bring to kids. And well, there's so many ways I want to go with this whole conversation, but it is, and I call it the event food chain, you know, and, but I like the word ecosystem better because it brings into the whole conversation, the earth and things, but we do have to have those conversations. And I will post a link to a checklist that I have of questions that we can ask our vendors our food and beverage partners, what do we have? And Sarah Braley, I'm going to update it for you as well. But those should be the questions that we ask. Who are your vendors?
Right. Yeah. One of the things that, the conversation, again, a lot of this work for me started with the Northern California chapter. And so one of the initiatives that we started looking at is changing your RFP, right? And so asking those questions on your request for proposal, like how do you, what is your DEI statement? What are your policies? What are your training? How do you address food diversity? Whatever questions that you need to get to align with your intentions or your mission or commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And if that vendor is not practicing, that way, or they're not living up to that commitment, they're going to get curious, or they're just not going to be the vendor that you want to align your business with. And those are the hard decisions that people have to make. If, we're talking, about accessibility, and you have a venue that does not have those parameters in place, or that's not something they're concerned with, well, then I don't recommend you doing business with that venue. Same thing with food and working with, the culinary team. If they're not willing to, adhere to the needs of your audience, then, either you're going to work together, or they're going to realize that this is a growing need and it's not a trend. It's not going anywhere. Right. And so if they don't know how to prepare this cuisine, education, go learn,
Right. And take requests from, your planners. And I remember I spoke at an industry convention years ago, and this woman said, yes, I gave my chef every single recipe that I wanted him to prepare. And I'm like, okay, that might be a little bit overboard. But, just saying, hey, these are the types of meals that I want to prepare. Can you do this? What are your thought processes around this? Right. But even like you said, with making the salad dressing vegan, I'm like, it's easy enough. Right.
Yeah. And I saw Shamika Jennings out there. Hi, Shamika. So Shamika and I just did this working session for the course that I'm teaching, where we went through the different domains. And I see that we went through the different domains. So when we're talking about stakeholder management, right, and that chef, that culinary team is a stakeholder, and so your ability to sit with them and engage with them and say, hey, I'm new to this journey of being committed to EDI, but here's what I want to do. I want to make sure that our food is an experience. I want to make sure it's representative of different cultures. I want to make sure that we have education and signage that it explains why we have different types of teas, or why we're preparing our chicken kosher or halal, and give that team an opportunity to be also a part of your experience, because that opportunity to be innovative, if we create this relationship with our partners, it's about more transformational than it is transactional. And so it's super important that you engage with all your stakeholders, because everyone contributes to that experience.
Well, and Bonnie Sepakowski mentioned that in an episode a couple months ago. I mean, she broke the barrier of getting past the CSM or the salesperson and talked to the culinary team.
Absolutely.
And then when she sat down and had this conversation, they were so engaged. And she said the level of food and beverage that she got was even more than what she expected, just from their conversations, because they were brought to the table as part of the team.
Yeah, they're a stakeholder. I mean, to the electricity, to the food, to the people setting up different booths, everybody. And again, it goes back to equity, diversity, inclusion, and being integrated into everything that you do.
Right.
These are human beings that you're working with, people who want to be innovative, people who want to be seen. And so you're planning this event. When you create, again, that ecosystem, everybody working together, then they're going to show up their best selves, because they're invited to do so. And then that's what inclusion is. So it's not just when we're focusing on the outcome, which is the event itself, but it starts all the way back to when we're building our teams and building our partner ecosystem. Again, that we're building relationships where we say, here are the preferences, here are the custom, requests. Be creative with it. Yes, we have. I remember we did an event, and we were doing a panel about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and those in the audience afterwards came up, and there was this long line, and it was at least 3 vegans and vegetarians. Like, yes, can we start advocating that we don't want just a hedge of lettuce? There are so many other vegan and vegetarian recipes, but every event we go to, when you order a vegetarian dish, they give you this wedge of lettuce with some, oil drizzled across and some tomatoes. Like that's it. But yet you go to these events that are centered around that cuisine, and there's jackfruit. There's so many interesting ways to eat. And so, yeah, you got to build those relationships so that people can be a part of your experience.
Yeah, I just was going to say that at one point there was quinoa like at every single meal, right? I mean, it's great. Right. It's a great protein, et cetera, right. But we need to do that. So one of the questions that I asked you pre-show was, what do you wish people knew about what you do?
Oh, what in short, I wish people knew that I want to inspire people to be curious, to critically think, right? I want you, I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I'm trying to tell you how to think, in a sense of being curious, being critical thinkers, and not just taking in a definition or something at face value, but digging deeper, and so yeah, that's, I'm like, did I tell you to ask me that question? Because that's hard. Let me see. But yeah, that these conversations, which I'm very happy to see over the last 2 years, that these conversations have been more welcomed. Initially, people would run from me, right? But
they run from me when I'm talking about food. So right. I'm right there with you. Yeah.
So if there's one thing I wanted them to know, is that I'm not trying to make your job harder. If anything, I'm trying to make you more successful and open your eyes to all the different opportunities and amazing people who have been historically and are presently excluded, how all this amazing talent is out there. And because we're not challenging our biases, we're not seeing how valuable those people are to, what we're building and what we're doing.
Well, and, when I posted the question or the comment, the thing about the religious and the healthcare, diversity, right? It's just having the conversation. And even when they're like requesting halal or kosher or whatever, pick up the telephone, and I know I use this quote all the time that a rabbi in Atlanta actually said, there's flexi kosher. So there's so many different levels of kosher adherence.
Right.
You really do need to pick up the telephone, and it's an okay conversation to have.
Right.
Saying, I want to make sure that we meet your needs to the level that you need us to. How can we best do that?
Right. Yeah. And that's also the other thing about not reinventing the wheel.
Right.
When that request comes in, more than likely and highly likely, there's an organization, there's an advocate, there is an advisor in your local area that has that information. And so again, build that relationship and ask them questions, And then, like you said, you can reach out to the attendee, or you can do, your homework. Google is a great resource, and you find these organizations who can also add value to your event. That long laundry list, that feeling of overwhelm can be reduced when we build relationship with, within that local area, or just, when you're not having events and you're building the infrastructure of your business, building those relationships is a key time to do that as well.
That's an awesome thing. And kind of going back to the food justice thing, thinking too, building the relationships within the city that you're having your event, is that we need to think about, if we do have excess food, where can we donate that food to, right? And that should be thought of at the very beginning in your RFP process. What organizations are you engaged with? Can we be engaged with? A lot of them are like, we can't do this, or we don't do this, or, start that conversation, because we can.
Yeah, and you're familiar with Goodr, Goodr, here in Atlanta. The story of the founder, Jasmine, I can't remember Jasmine's last name. It doesn't come top of mind, but Goodr, Gooddr. And her story as an entrepreneur, entrepreneurs already just think of ideas to fill those gaps, right? And so if that organization doesn't exist, there's an entrepreneur that's working on it,
right.
I believe. And so It's yeah. And so it's one of those things where this is an organization that fills that need,
Right.
where they're taking that extra food, that leftover food, and they've built a relationship with shelters, and they have again, similar to what the work that Black Panther started, is that they donate those to communities that need food.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So there are organizations who can be the answer to, the questions that you have. Do that homework, so
Right.
they can say, this is how I'm going to give back. We have a company that comes to pick up this food, and I've, supplied,
Yep.
to the local community. So again, it's that curious research. I just think
Right.
there's lots of opportunities out there to work with organizations who.
Yeah, and those companies, and the other one that I know of really well is Rock and Wrap It Up, and they will travel the country with you. They've
Yeah.
got the Gooder and Rock and Wrap It Up have the connections in the towns across the country
Yeah.
that can help you do it. So
Right.
make them one of your standard partners.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's, like I said, it's to reduce that feeling of
Mhm.
overwhelm. There is
Right.
someone who is well versed in that area and has that knowledge, has the resources, and the connection that they can have with you. I call it partnering with authenticity. You can use your events to highlight what they do, and then make them, known to your whole network. There's more event planners who are going to say, I need that service as well. And so you are helping another organization or a small business thrive by, using their service and their support.
Yep. When I just typed that in, partnering with authenticity.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah. So, okay. So the last question of the day is, what is your favorite food and drink?
What is my favorite food? So I lately drink. I can talk about that. I've been doing a lot of, what is it called? Mocktails.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
During the pandemic, I stopped drinking alcohol as often. I would say back in my military days, I was a little bit of a lush, but I wanted to cut back calories in one way. So I cut back, a lot on alcohol. And there's a lot of just creative mocktail recipes,
Mm-hmm.
cucumber, some mint, the San Pellegrino, a little bit of bubbly or spritzer, and just a lot of, blood orange. I like, those flavors.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't have the after effect of alcohol. And then when it
Right.
comes to food, I love everything food. Let's see, favorite food. I'm gonna go today. What am I feel like eating? I love salmon.
Okay.
I'm a seafood person. My next journey, my next phase of life is to be a pescatarian. So I
Okay.
love halibut. I love salmon. I love a well prepared, just tasty fish with some risotto on the side. Yeah. I'll go that route.
All right. And one thing that you did put down was arepas, and there is a great, what's that? What is that arepa store in Atlanta that it's so good?
It's cilantro's. That one, Venezuela.
No, I think it's down in the market in downtown Atlanta.
You have to send me the address, because my place
will.
Cilantro's. It's I don't have as much connection to my family as I would like, but it's rumored that my great grandfather is Venezuelan, and so when I was looking at Venezuelan restaurants, Cilantro's here, they have arepas that are just amazing. And I just came back from Colombia as well.
What?
Cartagena. Yeah, I was in Cartagena eating arepas like every day.
Did you run into Michael Douglas and?
I didn't. I don't know that story.
Well, Cartagena, that's Romancing the Stone. The movie Romancing the Stone. Oh, come on.
I think remember at the North Carolina event, somebody was asking me if I had seen Archie. What was it? The show that everyone was talking about? Bunker.
Archie Bunker. Yes. Oh my goodness. Now I can't remember it. Yes, but you hadn't seen that. Yeah.
Yeah. Everybody in the room was like, "Don't you know this show?" And I'm like, "I know Good Times."
Which was a great show as well.
Yeah. And it was just a good context to, sometimes we are so surprised when people don't watch what we watch. And I'm like, yeah,
right.
That's not, that show didn't speak to me, or wasn't a show that was in my, my forefront. But yeah, I don't know anything about Michael Douglas being in Cartagena, but I did learn a lot about it's the Palenquas, or it's the actually just outside of Cartagena is one of the first cities in the Americas where those who were formerly enslaved went, and they built their own town. And
Wow.
and so they're still it's a rich culture right outside of Cartagena. I think about 3 hours outside of Cartagena, but yeah, it's one of the first free towns in the Americas.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I want to learn more about that. And the show is called All in the Family that Archie Bunker was on.
All in the Family, yeah.
Or was in, yes. And then Mia Arepa's Mia, I just posted the link in the chat. But yeah, they're really, really good. And they're 100% gluten-free too. So
have you watched High on the Hog?
I've watched a couple of them. Yes. Stephen Satterfield. So Slow Food USA just did a virtual conference a couple of weeks ago, and Stephen Satterfield, who owns Miller Union in Atlanta, if you haven't eaten there, go eat there. Okay. So he's Steven Satterfield, and then he's friends with Stephen Satterfield of High of the Hog, and so that Stephen spells his name at Phen. Right. But so they had a really interesting conversation for that conference. And they get calls from me. People call the other one asking for reservations or asking for interviews and things like that by accident.
Yeah. I mentioned that because it just goes back to culture and the history of food. It's so beautiful when you start like learning the history of why we eat what we eat and where it comes from. So yeah, I really enjoy. I could watch that again. It makes me hungry every time I watch it, but it also makes me a little emotional just to learn that history. And actually, I wanted to go to South Carolina. I'm not that far,
No, you're not.
Yeah, for low food, cuisine.
An hour and a half to get to Augusta, and you're in South Carolina. Yeah,
I was stationed in Augusta when I was in the military.
Okay, yeah, and Greenville's 2 hours north of you. So
time to travel, domestic travel. That's what I
domestic travel. Well, Zoe, thank you so much for everybody here. This was Zoe Moore. She is, I'm going to get back to here. She is the founder of Growth with Zomo and is an independent equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant that helps leaders in the hospitality, events, and tourism industries. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for, bringing the conversation around food into this as well. And I have a session called DEI, what does food and beverage have to do with it, where I do talk about this as well. Actually, I've got it. I'm going to talk about it at Cater Source.
And you're going to be a guest on for a live session that we're doing, the Event Leadership Institute course.
Yes.
DEI strategist course. So you can drop that. I think I shared that link with you.
Let me get it.
Zomo.com/courses. You can access that course. And that's going on right now. There will be 3 more cohorts for the remainder of the year, but you're going to be a guest for the third live session.
Okay, awesome. COURSES. Okay, I'll put that in the chat. So I will actually put all your links to how to get a hold of you, but go growwithzomo.com, right?
Yep.
And that's on Instagram and Facebook as well. Yep. Shamika, thank you so much for being here the whole time. She just said great conversation, lots of good insight and actionable tips. Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate it. Thank you. And Zoe, thank you so much. I really, really, really appreciate what you do.
Yes. And me too. I appreciate you too. I'm glad we get to have this conversation and unpack that monolith that diversity is not. So.
Yes, exactly. All right. Until next time, everybody, stay safe and eat well. Check out Zoe's website and join the Eating at a Meeting Facebook group. It is free to join, and we talk about these conversations all the time. And also, make sure you download it onto your phone and listen to it while you're exercising. Yes. Have a great day, everybody. Until next time.